Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich, online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Practice Makes Perfect, Skill Stories in the Zhuangzi. Butchers, carpenters, and swimmers appear in stories scattered throughout the Zhuangzi, with a few of them in Chapter 19 entitled Comprehending Life. This title, in Chinese Da Sheng, conveys the idea of grasping what life is about in a general sense. One gets it, as we might now say. So it's telling that many of the stories are collected here in this chapter. The Zhuangzi celebrates the life of people doing everyday things. Unlike many other texts of the Warring States period, it doesn't promote how officials should live, advising them on managing their superiors and handling the common people by setting up standards or doctrines. This text even seems to speak from the perspective of ordinary people. Not that the Zhuangzi thinks they're ordinary. To the contrary, the mastery with which they undertake their tasks is extraordinary and worthy of philosophical reflection. These passages have often been called skill stories. The Zhuangzi uses them to challenge the views promoted by other thinkers, not by showing that they're wrong, but by offering a different perspective, that of people doing everyday things. We might compare this to the use of the animal stories we discussed in the last episode, likewise meant to provoke stuffy men who are full of self-importance. Instead of such gentlemen, we meet a butcher who expertly glides his knife through the space in the joints of oxen. He imparts insights on how to navigate the hazards of political life. There's a wheelmaker who compares the right way of engaging with the world to his own feeling of the wood with his hand and response with his heart-mind. Then there's the swimmer in dangerous waters, who makes a conscious decision not to assert his own way, or Tao, instead going along with the Tao of the water. But let's begin with the story of the bell stand carver, Qing. You're unlikely to have a bell stand at home, but in ancient China they played an important function. They were needed for the very large bells used in ritual ceremonies. Qings are so amazing that people think they are the work of spirits. In the story, when he is asked what his technique is, he starts at the beginning. He talks about how he fasts for days before he enters the forest to pick a tree. After fasting for 3 days, he forgets rewards and promotions. After 5, he doesn't care about praise or skill, and after 7, he forgets his own limbs and body, as well as the demands of the court. In fact, he even forgets why he came into the forest in the first place. Only once he has achieved this frame of mind, he says, does he ascend the mountain and examine the nature of the trees. Should he encounter no tree fit for being made into a bell stand, he simply leaves the forest again. And that's the whole story, which may seem anticlimactic and more than a little odd. You'd have expected Qing to tell us how to carve bell stands, not how to select trees, or indeed how to decline to do so. His account is wrapped up with a little boast. I am just matching the heavenly to the heavenly. This may be the reason the result suggests the work of spirits. In this remark, we may take the second, heavenly, to refer to this nature of the trees. This nature is given in the sense that it is not up to Qing to change it. He has to work with, rather than against, the nature of trees. He achieves this by leaving behind thoughts of reward and promotion, the demands of the court, even his own person. The passage literally says that he forgets all such concerns. A typical bell stand maker might think, I've got to make a bell stand for a 5-foot diameter bell, so I'm off to find a tree of the right size to make my ideal bell stand. Qing apparently doesn't work this way. He's left all that baggage behind so that he can appreciate the tree's wood as it is. By implication, the concerns about promotions and ideal bell stands are not natural. In forgetting them, Qing allows what is natural or heavenly in himself to match the heavenly or given nature of each tree. The fact that Qing is prepared to leave the trees alone may remind us of that other story in the Zhuangzi, in which a sacred tree says it is glad to be made of useless wood, since this meant it was never cut down. Qing's responsive engagement with nature also illustrates the Zhuangzian theme of understanding qian. We've met this term several times before, most recently in the last episode, when we spoke about the Zhuangzis having a less hierarchical conception of beings in the natural world, with both humans and non-human animals being seen as part of that world. The word tian, often translated as heaven, doesn't refer to a divine transcendent being, but rather to the natural world itself. That includes not only animate beings, but also flora and fauna, habitats, ecosystems, the relations between beings and entities, forces and energies, and cosmic phenomena. In Taoist philosophy, all these taken together are called the Wang Wu, most often translated as 10,000 things. They constitute a world that lies beyond human design and action, and of which humans are a part. In the Zhuangzi, this idea is also expressed with talk of destiny, Ming. We humans cannot control and orchestrate everything. We just have to accept things such as our own lifespan and health, and whether we are high-ranking or not, poor or rich, hungry or thirsty, cold or warm. A passage in the Zhuangzi advises that we should understand these circumstances as the transformations of events, the proceedings of destiny. Here, we might think back to the Shunzi and its advice not to be superstitious about natural events, like eclipses and earthquakes. These too are just given features of the world around us. To this extent, the Zhuangzi would agree with the Shunzi, but it adds that aspects of our human life condition us too, such as those in the socio-political domain. Whereas Zhuangzi believes that human interactions should be carefully regulated so that humans may flourish within an orderly moral regime, the Zhuangzi does not see why human interactions should or even could be rigidly controlled. This disagreement may begin from their different views of heaven, or the heavenly. Whereas in the Shunzi and other Confucian texts, Tian is the transcendent moral order, in the Zhuangzi, Tian often refers simply to this world we are embedded in. No surprise, then, that the Shunzi criticizes Zhuangzi's view of Tian. This brings us to a second theme connected to the skill stories, which is closely related to the first. As humans, we need to be responsive to the world around us. This also helps us understand why the Zhuangzi is critical of black and white shi-fei thinking, which tries to pin down right and wrong for all. Woodcarver Qing is a model of responsive action. Forgetting his worldly concerns, he responds to the heavenly nature of the trees rather than imposing on the trees the function he intends for them. If he were to go into the forest simply to cut down trees that match his plans for a bell stand, he would be engaging in shi-fei thinking. This tree is useless, that one's perfect. In contrast to the invocation of standards we've found in Moism, and will soon be seeing even more prominently in the so-called legalist tradition, the Zhuangzi does not recommend the application of set norms. Rather, one should react spontaneously, letting oneself be guided by the environment rather than forcing the environment to fit into one's own preconceived notions and goals. We see again how responsiveness is manifest in the work of a wheelmaker called Flat, such as the Zhuangzi's humor, who speaks with the Duke Huan. The story opens with a scene, as if in a play, marking out their different status. While the wheelmaker is working in the hall down below, the Duke is in the hall above, reading. Speaking out of turn, indeed quite out of place, the wheelmaker puts down his tools and ascends the hall to where the Duke is. He asks the Duke, "Sir, may I ask what sort of words you are perusing?" The Duke said, "The words of the sages." "Are those sages still alive?" "They are dead," said the Duke. "Then what you are perusing is no more than the dregs and dust of the ancients." Duke Huan said, "Does a wheelwright dare pass judgment on what his ruler reads? If you can explain yourself, well and good. If not, you shall die." We might agree that the wheelmaker deserves some kind of censure for his insolence, but surely he shouldn't have to lose his life. For him now, much turns on how he answers the Duke. Flat, the wheelmaker, tells the Duke that he can only see it from how he handles his own work. He talks about his carving. "When I carve a wheel, if I hit the chisel too gently, it slides along but does not take hold. If I hit too hard, it jams and cannot go further. Not too gentle, not too hard. I feel it in my hand and respond to it with my heart-mind. I cannot put this into words, even though I grasp what is involved there in the activity." It would have been quite typical for people who worked in the manual crafts at that time to use measuring instruments. By contrast, Flat is carving freehand. This sets up a comparison that is unflattering to the Duke. If the wheelwright can only feel what he does and cannot express it in words, how could the Duke hope to learn from the words of others, particularly men who are long dead? Flat goes on to elaborate on how he has tried to impart his understanding to his own son, but to no avail. Only long practice enables one to acquire such skill. He finishes with the statement, "The ancients died, and that which they could not transmit died along with them. So I say that what you, my lord, are perusing is just the dregs and dust of the ancients, nothing more." The story ends there, so we don't find out whether the Duke was persuaded to spare the wheelwright's life. Of course, that's not the point of the tale. Rather, we are invited here to think about how Duke Huan is living out his official role. He spends his time reading the words of sages, as a Confucian ruler might do. Xunzi would surely approve, but the wheelwright does not, and for several reasons. First, being good at a task requires our own input. The Duke merely seeks to apply, or to reapply, what the earlier sages did. Instead, he needs to put his own hand to the wheel and get a feel for what he is doing. Second, the story teaches us about the limits of words. The story is not necessarily against the reading of books or listening about them in podcasts, but rather cautions us about how to use them. To read the words of sages, even if they did in fact do great things in the past, has limited applicability. Just as measuring instruments guide the practices of carpenters, the words of sages are guides for those who hold them up. But Flat doesn't use instruments. Moreover, he says that he hasn't been able to teach wheelmaking to his son, and this is meant to be a personal takeaway for the Duke. A teaching, a Tao that is somebody else's Tao, can only go that far. That might be why, even if teachers are mentioned elsewhere in the Zhuangzi, they are not present in the stories about mastery. This brings us to a third and final point, which has to do with first-hand experience. It is Flat's responsiveness to the wood that is central to his craft, and it should be the Duke's responsiveness to his people that is central to his rule. One of the duties of rulers and officials was to take tours of the land so as to understand the needs of the people. Flat doesn't explicitly mention this point, but it's one way in which the Duke could be a better official, by being out there with his people, rather than hiding himself away in the hall above and reading in isolation from them. Given what we've said about there being no teachers in the mastery stories, it is ironic that in some of them, the people speaking with the masters specifically say that they have learned from them. It may be that these masters do not have the intention to teach, but manage to do it anyway. As so often in these Taoist texts, goals are not best achieved through conscious pursuit of those goals. This point also emerges in a famous story in the Zhuangzi about a cook named Ding, who has inspired a king on how to nurture life. Even more so than in the wheelmaker story, Cook Ding is so absorbed in his task, in this case carving an ox, that it seems as if he's in a trance. The cook was carving up an ox for King Hui of Liang. Wherever his hand smacked it, wherever his shoulder leaned into it, wherever his foot braced it, wherever his knee pressed in, the thwacking tones of flesh falling from bone would echo. The knife would whiz through with its resonant thwing, each stroke ringing out the perfect note, attuned to the dance of the mulberry grove or the Xingshu chorus of the ancient sage kings. Whoosh! All at once I find the ox already dismembered at my feet, like clumps of soil scattered on the ground. I retract the blade and stand there, gazing at it all around me, both disoriented and satisfied by it all. Then I wipe off the blade and put it away. Here we have an expert in action, whose fluid movements and spontaneous excellence we see today in world-class athletes and musicians. The cook also seems to enjoy this activity, even if it's not explicitly stated. Some of the masters in other stories, such as a boatman and a scribe, enjoy the satisfaction of doing something well and in a seemingly effortless way. The king, noting Ding's expertise, remarks on his outstanding skill. Ding responds by speaking of how he navigates the space between the ox's joints, saying that he hasn't had to sharpen his blade for 19 years. Here, Ding seems quite boastful. A good cook changes his blade once a year. He slices. An ordinary cook changes his blade once a month. He hacks. By contrast, Ding's own blade is still as sharp as the day it came off the whetstone after 19 years. We also learn what Ding does when his task gets tricky. Whenever I come to a clustered tangle, realizing that it is difficult to do anything about it, I instead restrain myself, as if terrified, until my seeing comes to a complete halt. My activity slows, and the blade moves ever so slightly. This, too, is what experts know: when to slow down and attend closely to what's at hand. Even though Ding wasn't trying to teach the king, and the king clearly wasn't seeking to learn about butchering, the king says that he's learned from Ding how to nurture life. In the face of the complexities of the court and political rule, he too needs to slow down to consider the intricate facets of a situation. Notice also the parallel to Qing, the carver of bell stands, who showed his mastery by choosing on occasion not to cut down a tree. It is tempting to read both passages in the light of the Taoist concept of wu wei, or non-action, which also has political application. Sometimes the right action is a very minimal action, or no action at all. Cook Ding also talks about honing his capacities and putting the right ones into action. When he began, he relied on eyesight, simply looking at the entire ox. No doubt this is what we'd do too if we were asked to carve up an ox. Without any experience, we'd look it over, confounded about how to proceed. After 3 years of practice, by contrast, Ding no longer saw the entire ox. This suggests that seeing the whole ox is pointless or even a hindrance to butchering. Now, still more accomplished, Ding no longer sees with his eyes and is not guided by sensory perception more generally. Instead, he is guided by his spirit. The idea of the spirit, shen, is immensely complex. It can refer to a religious dimension of human existence, but may also refer, more broadly, to the immaterial aspects of human and all existence. In this context, we may understand Ding to be saying that he has stopped using obvious physical sensory capacities like sight and hearing. This echoes the way Qing undergoes fasting to help him forget the demands of court life, and the way the wheelmaker, flat, feels with his hand and responds with his heart-mind. Here, we may detect a fourth important theme in the Zhuangzi's skill stories. There's often a whole-body engagement that does not prioritize cognition or any specialized moral capacity. It is possible to develop the range of human capacities without the application of standards and normative practices, hence the different way that the Confucians and Taoists speak of the heart-mind. Whereas in Confucianism, the heart-mind must be developed to embrace virtue, the wheelmaker story makes almost the reverse point. The heart-mind must remain open and unfixed, open to spontaneous engagement with the world. We just referred to these tales again as skill stories, and there's some basis for that in the text. The king says to Ding after his carving of the ox, "Ah, it is wonderful that skill can reach such heights." But maybe talk of skill doesn't quite cover it, since Ding responds, "What I love is Tao, going beyond mere skill." We find a different term for skill in a tale about a cicada catcher who converses with Kongzi, and Qing the word carver is said to have technique, though this doesn't seem to be foregrounded in his story, which instead focuses on his selection of trees. As Eric Schwitzgevel points out, all of the other stories, often collectively called the skill stories, are found outside the Zhuangzi's inner chapters. So within the inner chapters, argues Schwitzgevel, the story of Cook Ding is anomalous in its focus on skill. We should not be too quick to associate success with skill. Rather, Schwitzgevel writes, success, wisdom, flexibility, or magic might, for example, be innate, or based merely on attention to the right things, or due to chance, or due to not being interfered with, or due to avoiding certain kinds of mistakes, or due to having an easygoing or open-minded personality. In fact, Schwitzgevel argues that the Zhuangzi's inner chapters are, if anything, critical of mere skill. This is why the cook says that he goes beyond skill and loves Tao. In this connection, Dan Robbins has proposed that Tao cannot be fully expressed in relation to any one skill or any one way of understanding a task. This might have been the mistake made by the king. In his lack of familiarity with the Tao, he seeks to learn about skill and compliments Cook Ding for his high level of skill. Ding subtly corrects the king's misunderstanding by refocusing him on Tao. At the end of the story, the king says, "Wonderful. From hearing the cook's words, I have learned how to nourish life." This must mean that he has learned how to navigate the challenges of his own life in the court. The king should have learned, for instance, to be attentive and hesitant when he comes to an impasse, and to act with smooth efficacy when an opening emerges, just as Ding describes his own technique. Striking into the enormous gaps, my knife is guided through those huge hollows, going along in accord with what is already there and how it already is. Ding's performance and words are not prescriptions, but rather exemplifications of Tao. They are only one way in which Tao may be embodied. There are, after all, many different ways to go along with what is already there and how it already is, as the Zhuangzi puts it. As we've seen in this and previous episodes, though, the Confucian way was not one of those approved by the Zhuangzi. The story of the wheelwright, for instance, seems to be specifically aimed at the Ru and their fetishistic study of old books, which makes it puzzling that Kongzi appears so often in the Zhuangzi as a character, and not always in a negative light. Whereas some passages do seem to put him in his place as someone who does not understand the Tao, in other passages he's apparently a spokesman for the Zhuangzi's own ideas. This calls for some explanation, which we'll attempt to give next time, as we ask whether Taoists really rule the day Kongzi was born, here on The History of Philosophy in China.